Streaming is on.
So, for today's book of the month, I decided, because we used to have a lot more regular members coming every week, especially when we were founded, and last year it was pretty easy to get a book of the month suggestions from people. But after a while, we stopped having recurring members. I think we have more though. We have Gonzalo, Sarah comes often. So at the end of this, I will request the book of the month suggestions. That would be great. They don't have to be books. They could be collections of essays. Like back in January, we planned on doing Montaigne. So it doesn't have to be a book, but it does have to be some lengthy review of either a novel, a set of essays, or articles with a common theme. And for today, I thought this year, so I never know what kind of pattern to put on for the Berlin Stoics, whether to do the same things every year for every month. So every January we do X, Y, and Z. So for example, but I'll keep it open. I'll keep it organic. And sometimes we recur certain themes. Like next week, we're going to meet up in person on Saturday and online next Wednesday. We're going to be meeting up about resilience in psychology, and specifically cognitive behavioral therapy and its connection to Stoicism, which we've done before. So, but not at the same time of the year. So we will recur certain themes. We don't have really any necessarily some sort of fixed system. But I thought it would be best that, and for example, next month in April, in substitution for one of our introductory presentations in Stoicism, I'm going to do an introductory presentation on logic. So I thought it would be good to get an idea of what logic is all about. And then we can, afterwards, we can then spend maybe a month looking at ethics in general as well, not just Stoic ethics, but ethics in general. So virtue ethics, value ethics, utilitarian ethics. And then we can come around to also talk about metaphysics and the history of science, because these were the three fields around which Stoicism was built: the study of logic, the study of ethics, and the study of physics. Not in that order necessarily. I think they thought physics and logic, physics being metaphysics in general, metaphysics and logic were the foundations on which ethics was built. But nevertheless, they had these three spheres of study. So I think logic wasn't picked at random. It was chosen because this was one of the first of three fields of study the Stoics and largely a lot of other philosophers around the time as well thought were essential to understanding the world around us. Sarah asked, so the Saturday in-person and the Wednesday online event will both be on CBT. They'll be a little bit different, Sarah. I didn't want to always duplicate because I know people like coming to both. Sometimes I will duplicate, sometimes I won't. This time, they run parallel to each other, so they're the same theme, but they're on different topics. So on Saturday is more about specific cases, especially in wartime, how soldiers can effectively use resilience training and Stoicism to become less violent. I found this great research article I wanted to share with everybody on JSTOR about how the soldiers in Abu Ghraib, the American soldiers that perpetrated war crimes of torture at Abu Ghraib some years ago, this article claims that it has been proven in other examples and other case studies that resilience training can actually de-aggressify, what's the word I'm looking for? Make less violent or aggressive soldiers. So I thought it would be really, really interesting to look at that Saturday. And then on Wednesday is more specifically CBT, but they're similar in the sense that we're looking at resilience training. They just have different case studies and examples we'll be looking at. Okay, so yeah, so that's coming up on Saturday and Wednesday. And today, so for everybody, especially watching this who's not here, this was our book of the month. I was looking for a book on logic, and I really liked this one because while I've studied logic at university, this was the first time I ever read a book or read anything placing logic in its historical context. That's kind of the first thing I wanted to bring up. I'll ask questions just in case either two of you or that are here have read the book or have had exposure to the book. But just to start off, I really enjoyed this book, and I'm happy that the book. I actually only made it through chapter 7. There's 10 chapters, so I haven't had the time to completely finish it. But one consistent pattern you can see across every chapter is that the beginning and end of every chapter isn't really about logic. It's about the historical and cultural context around which the logicians or the philosophers started gathering their ideas. One great example of this is actually chapter 6. Yes, chapter 6. Chapter 6 is titled Logical Fanatics, Circular Reasoning, and Descartes' Fundamental Principle. And it takes place because he gives a great background on the 15th all the way through the 17th century and the wars of religion and the fanaticism around the time. So witch trials, Protestant Reformation, and there was just a propensity of violence around Europe and the Americas around that time over religion itself. The English Civil War. So there was just a lot going on. And he places, for example, Descartes' understanding of logic and science and philosophy in that background, because the milieu, the cultural milieu around the time, the authors argue, is that the fanatics were basing their arguments on sound logic. If you heard them, they made valid logical arguments. But Descartes knew what they were saying was complete bullshit, but he didn't know why. So his investigation saw, and Descartes identified that the faults with the fanatics was not their argumentation, the structure of their argumentation. It was their assumptions. And so Descartes tried to, at this stage in history, he understood the laws of logic, and fanatics did too, to carry out their wars of religion. But Descartes wanted to understand, if their assumptions were wrong, then how do you choose correct assumptions from which you can make correct conclusions about the world? He took a very skeptic stance, which I don't agree with. He took a very, very strict stance that the only thing you can really be sure of and assume for sure without any prior knowledge is that you exist, right? I think therefore I exist. It's a very famous line. I also agree with modern philosophers that's too scant of a body of assumptions to live yourself off of, because you can't really conclude anything from that. You can conclude some things maybe, but really you can't conclude a lot from that. But nevertheless, that's just an example I wanted to point out, and we can come back to that chapter in specifics. But as that example, I thought it was really, really interesting that while a book on logic can seem very dry and taxing to people, this is not a textbook. This is a book on the cultural and historical background under which these philosophers and logicians introduced their new logic, or their new advancement in understanding logic. So that's really why I chose this book, because it gave a new spin on understanding logic, not just from what is logic, but also how did logic come about? Because every chapter you start to get the sense that the next logician in history was developing a new framework to understand logic based upon a reaction to what was going on around at the time. In fact, the next chapter after chapter 6 was chapter 7, which is on the logic of induction, which is what science uses, not coming from assumptions to conclusions, but rather coming from so basic assumptions to draw specific conclusions, but to draw from specific observations to general conclusions about the world, as a rebuttal to the deduction, the fanatics' use of just very dry assumptions lead to my conclusions, therefore I'm right kind of logic. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a lot of pushback using science and induction. The author claims that it was a response to the aggressive fanatics of the wars of religion. So when this buildup of commerce, trade, and science was happening all the way from the 17th to the 19th century. It was unbeknownst to them at the time, but probably a response to that, and a best way for people to exercise a new type of logic. So it's very, very interesting, this book. I do have to say it connects previous knowledge that I already knew about history to the development of logic as a field of study in a way I never understood before. Did either of you read the book, or either of you read a little bit of the book? Like I said, I only had time to read 7 chapters since the last month. But have either of you yourselves gotten a chance to read it? Yeah. Oh, Sarah, we can't hear you. We also can't see you, by the way. I don't know if you knew that was a problem or if you just left your camera off. If your camera off, that's fine, but I also can't hear you now. I'm going to continue, but if you need to log on, log off. Okay, that's fine. But if you wanted to say something, yeah, you can always write in the chat. And don't worry about logging on and logging back off, or logging off and logging back on, just to try it again. But that's fine. So nobody has to read it. But instead of me just strolling on,
yeah,
exactly.
It's similar with me, actually. I haven't read it as well, either.
That's fine. So instead of me just making this into an entire lecture and book review, it is a book review, but I would like to also take passages from this and then hear what you folks think, instead of me just drolling on, because apart from me, not everybody likes hearing the sound of one person's voice for 2 hours. So there's a great passage he has. I'm going to skip chapter 1. That's what I'm going to do. So the first chapter, the introduction in the first chapter is about the birth of logic and understanding what logic is in general. But we'll skip that in just a second. We can come back to that because there's other great passages. But the third chapter, chapter 3, right after he discusses Aristotle's, chapter 4. Oh, there was quite a few chapters before that. Right after he discusses Aristotle's foundation of logic, he all of a sudden starts talking about Chrysippus, the Stoic logician, the Stoic that not just built the foundation of Stoic logic, but logic in general. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, is Aristotle's way of logically deducing conclusions. But Chrysippus expanded it a whole lot. Chrysippus, for example, expanded it into, for example, the famous modus ponens. It's Latin for an implication, pretty much. And many people have heard this kind of logical structure, right? If A, then B, A is true, therefore B is true. So it's a logical implication. If you know the conditional statement, if A, then B to be true, and you know the antecedent, the first part, A to be true, then you know B to be true. Otherwise, the conditional wouldn't be true. And so Chrysippus also contributed a lot to logic in general. And in fact, his logic would be used extensively centuries, almost a millennium later, when George Boole would found his Boolean logic. So it was quite a foundation that they built, both Aristotle and Chrysippus. But there was a passage in here that I started writing in the book. It was great. Okay. It's actually on the 5th chapter. So if anybody's interested, yeah, this is, so after he discusses Aristotle and Chrysippus, his 5th chapter is on logic versus anti-logic. And this entire chapter, he's dispelling, trying to dispel confusion around what logic is exactly and what logic isn't. Okay. This is where he gets good. I think the 5th chapter was my favorite, but this is what he says. He's reviewing logic from the Greeks before he moves on in history, but also comparing it with anti-logic, comparing it with what people consider to be logic, and how the word logic can actually be abused to mean something differently than it actually is. So I'll read the whole paragraph. The task of the early Greek logicians was to cut through obscurities and confusions and to arrive at the ideas of truth and falsity that regulate reasoning in the ordinary sense of the word. Remember that logic is the study of arguments, and an argument to a logician is an attempt at proof. In that case, however, no matter how uncertain our various opinions may be at any one time or in any one historical period, argumentation will be useful only under particular conditions. Logicians in many ages have described these conditions, sometimes in varying ways, but the account we give now is not much different from accounts given by others, whether by Aristotle or by those who came after. What he's basically explaining is, and he goes on to explain these conditions, and we can go on to these in detail. He's saying a couple of things. For one thing, he's saying that logic is not the study of what conclusions you make and not the assumptions you have. Logic is the study of using those assumptions, conclusions, and constructing a valid argument. So logic is about the structure of the argument, not so much about whether or not your assumptions or conclusions are correct. That you have to decide for yourself. The conclusions draw naturally, logically from the assumptions, but the assumptions you decide for yourself. It's the argument that logic is concerned with. But because logic is about the argument and not necessarily about the assumptions you're making, and logic certainly doesn't care about the conclusions, they just follow naturally from how you logically conclude based upon the assumptions you give, right? Your outputs naturally come from your inputs. He's also saying that no matter what historical period you live in, these laws of logic persist. It's not like science or math. It's not like science, and in some cases, it's not even like mathematics. Although mathematics is pretty close to logic in this sense, but logic is eternal. Aristotle wasn't outdated in his logic. His logic is still studied and required to be so by computer scientists today. I just find that fascinating. I love that too. I love that too when I understand logic, that it's an eternal field. There's kind of nothing historically dependent about logic or culturally dependent about logic. And that's my question to you. So to open it up about to you guys here, what do you think about that? My question is, do you agree and do you think that logic is eternal, that there's really no wrong about logic, whether it's a logical system and foundation founded by Aristotle all the way up to today, on which we still build our current logic? We still have to build the system of logic we have today on his system. Do you really see it as eternal, or do you have a problem with that statement, that logic is eternal, that logic is not dependent on historical or cultural period? And if so, maybe you can define for yourself what logic is. He's defining, and to a logician, logic is specifically about the study of arguments. But in your experience, what have you come to know about logic? What do you consider to be logic itself? Oh, Sarah, I know your mic is off. But Matus, if you're interested, you can also respond.
I think that this statement seems pretty reasonable. I was thinking about physics, like a comparison between physics. It seems to me that laws of physics might be eternal too. I mean, we might discover some new truths, but the old ones actually are still valid. I mean, they are updated. I mean, we discover new knowledge, but the old knowledge often is still relevant. So it seems pretty similar for me with logic.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know the common refrain about physics, for example, is classical, Newtonian mechanics is outdated. Quantum mechanics and Einstein's general relativity is more updated, which is true. The quantum mechanic theory and general relativity theory are definitely more refined, they're more precise. But we use Newtonian mechanics all the time. Literally ask a rocket scientist, and they'll tell you they use Newtonian mechanics. So you are right. I mean, there's not just logic that persists, but logic is different because even in physics, for example, the idea of the atom, for example. I mean, we no longer think of the atom as just a billiard ball. This was a conception by Democritus all the way back to the Greeks. And the idea that there's only 4 types, right? Fire, earth, water, and air. So theories do come and go. It's not all linear. This is, of course, it's much more so for the human sciences like psychology and other social sciences, where our theoretical framework that's dominated by consensus changes from decade to decade, whereas physical theories change centuries to centuries. So yeah, physics is more persistent than other sciences, but logic is a field that just persists. I mean, nobody debates the logic of all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You can maybe sometime in the future you can argue that not all men are immortal, or maybe you can philosophically argue that Socrates is immortal in the sense that his works and his ideas spread, right? So you can debate about that, but whatever you do, however you define the word is, the structure of that statement will always remain valid. No matter how you define, and you can of course do so, but no matter how you can define what mortal is or what Socrates is, that framework always persists. It's eternal. Yeah, but thanks for your input. And also, good point about physics. Logic is not the field that sustains itself over time. Mathematics is even closer, right? We still use the same geometric proofs that we got from Pythagoras thousands of years ago. So there's another one. And there's another one he speaks about, which is, I think, much more interesting. This is a good one. So to give you some background for this paragraph in my next question, the authors, sorry, they, I kept to stop saying they make the argument, and rightly so, I think, that logic precedes everything else. That there's nothing that underlies logic. In fact, asking what makes the argument all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, asking why that's logical and why that's valid is like asking what's outside of the physical universe. It's meaningless because the physical universe is space and time. So it's meaningless to ask what's outside of time. You get what I'm saying? So it's they make the argument that you can't really ask why it's valid. It's just valid. It's just according to our capacity to reason. It is just a logically valid argument. There's nothing to say about it. Then he goes on to he discusses at length, but I'll isolate this paragraph. He discusses at length at attempts by logicians in the past to ground logic in certain other conditions. Like, for example, logical arguments are only logically valid because they're useful, right? Or our system of logic is only valid because it's useful, right? So they kind of refer to usefulness or utility as the reason why this logical system works. But then he continues and he says something I think really, really nice. In a word, if logic is useful, then usefulness always puts a limit to what anyone can regard in ordinary practical matters as truly logical, even if a world of alternative logical principles should be somehow possible. And in that case, we should add, the logical correctness of ordinary reasoning doesn't depend on its usefulness. Rather, its usefulness depends on its correctness. If we don't reason in logically correct ways, we get useless results. And what then follows is that the usefulness of the reasoning depends on its correctness, not the other way around. In summary, the great mass of practical intuitions that we often call common sense will still set boundaries to what anyone can sensibly devise as a plausible system of formal logic. And there are other systems of logic, and he even explains this, and if you want, you can do exterior research to this. But even those alternative systems of logic still rely on the same foundational principles of logic in general. They may tweak one or two principles, but they still rely on, for example, what makes an argument valid. So they still rely on those basic principles. And that's something very special, is what he's saying, is that the validity of an argument being correct, it doesn't come from its utility. Otherwise, what's correct in logic is limited by how practical it is. No, how something is practical or utilized is affected by how correct the argument is. It's for example, if a lawyer were to get up in a courtroom, is what he's saying, and make an argument in defense of his client, the only reason his argument is useful or practical, the only reason it would work, is if it's a correct argument. Of course, lawyers can be terrible people, and they could defend terrible people, right? So you may be thinking their argument's terrible, but the argument may still be sound and valid. Again, just like the early fanatics of the wars of religion, they're just coming from terrible assumptions, like my client is right or something like that. But their system of logic is correct. But that's the point he's trying to make. And my question to you is, have you, in your common everyday experience, have you ever experienced a time when you felt like there was a logical requirement that you must do this or that because something was in contradiction to one another, and you felt stuck, like you couldn't do anything about it, that it was just a logical choice to make, this or that, or some other number of choices, but only those a selection of choices, because logically nothing else made sense, or logically you could conclude nothing else from the given conditions and experiences that you had. Was there any time or moment where you thought that logic was restricting you? You hated it, but it was just something logically you had to choose between. So a bit more of a personal question. Doesn't have to be a very personal experience, but any time that you felt like logic was dictating the terms of your actions or decision making. And Sarah, if you do want to, if you do want to participate, you can write in the chat. We can read.
So I think that there might be some ideas that I don't think that I don't support, but I think that they might be logical, right? There are some activities in lives that I encounter. I'm thinking about vegetarianism, for instance. For me, I don't follow this, but I have this feelings that okay, there are some arguments that seem logical for me in this case.
You said with respect to you were using the example of an organism. You said.
Once again.
What did you say you were using? You were saying you're using the excuse me. You were using the example of an organism, or like you were using, or you were using. Sorry, go ahead.
No, actually, I just thought about being vegetarian, and this is not something that I follow. I'm not vegetarian, but I heard some arguments that seems to me logical, even though I don't follow them.
Yeah, it's but that's the point. So that's good you mentioned that. So I'm vegan. Maybe we can review some we can review some arguments of this. So yeah, you're right. So I mean, what turned me over to veganism, or you turned to vegetarianism? So I'll start. The argument that struck me, that turned me over to veganism, was of course, nowadays I accept the health benefits and the ethical arguments for veganism, but the first thing that drew me to veganism was environmental reasons, that it was the best for the environment. I don't know, why did you think about vegetarianism? What was the argument that it most affected you?
I think that that environmental argument is valid, and I'm thinking about it. That yes, this is a valid point, but still there are some other points that makes me think that this is not enough to just abandon completely abandon eating meat. For instance, some health benefits, because in nutrition you may people that follow vegetarianism may lack some nutrients that come from meat, and this is more difficult to have a healthy diet. You need to know much more about nutrition to have a healthy diet completely without meat. So this is one thing that makes me think that it is not that easy to just say to everybody that they should become vegan or vegetarian straight away.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And you touch upon something I eventually wanted to get into, but this is perfect to get into now. Actually, I haven't gotten to it. So the next chapter, I think it's 8 or 9. So it's one of the next 2 chapters. I'll get to you in a second, Sarah. I'm just going to make a thank you for, by the way, contributing. Keep writing. But just to respond to Matus, in one of his later chapters, he discusses the limits of logic. And I think this is a great example of the vegetarian and veganism thing, where for you and I, Matus, we were drawn to veganism for the environmental reasons, right? So if we had to make an argument, we would say something like the least land mass used for animal farming, the cleaner the air, right? Because the less carbon dioxide and methane, especially the methane, the less methane is released into the atmosphere. It's a greenhouse gas. If we want to help stave off global warming to an extent that we can actually survive on this planet, we need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, right, you see how we're using these conditional statements. Therefore, in order to make the Earth a habitable place, to stave off global warming to the extent where we can't live here anymore, I need to eat less meat, right? I need to eat less meat. I need to be vegan or vegetarian, right? So this is a logical argument we're making, but it's logical not because the conclusion is correct. It's logical because the argument is correct. I often find that, I don't know about you two, I often find that people say, oh, it's very logical that you can do this. Well, they're using logic in an incorrect way. You know, it's, of course, their argument may be logical. Like my argument was very logical, but that doesn't mean the conclusion is the best one for you. And I still believe that veganism is the best diet, but I can't prove that using just logic, right? There's a limit to logic. Logic can help you make the arguments sound and valid, but it can't tell you which conclusions are correct. It can only tell you the conclusions are correct based on your assumptions or based upon your starting conditions or your arguments. Like, for example, Matus was saying, oh, he's heard that vegans sometimes lack nutrients, which is correct. If you don't take any supplements or added nutrition, and just go vegan, right? Just eat some lentils and beans every day, some mushrooms and broccoli every day. Okay, that's great. It's healthy, but you're missing especially B12 and D3. I mean, well, D3 we often all need to take when we get to a certain age because, it's age and we don't go outside as often as we used to as humans. So we need to take D3. But B12 is a great example for vegans, where every vegan should be taking B12 supplements because you can really only get that in meat. So it is possible to live on a vegan diet healthily, but you still need to take the B12 supplements in order to be healthy while on that vegan diet. But that's an example where, Matus, if somebody was arguing, yes, but let's say somebody was making the argument about health, right, instead of the environment, and they were saying, in order to be healthy, so if I want to be healthy, I need to eat wholly organic and garden grown foods, right? If I can only eat garden grown and organic foods, I cannot be taking artificial supplements or supplements, even though they were extracted from something organic. It's still artificial in the sense that it was put in a capsule. You still have to take it every day, right? Therefore, if I want to be healthy, I can't abstain from eating meat. Maybe they can reduce their meat consumption, which is great. Still good for the environment, still better for the environment. But from their perspective, they're making the correct judgment. Now, both arguments are completely logically valid. It's just that they're coming from different starting points, different assumptions, different conditions. So this is a great example of the limits of logic. Logic can give you structure and tell you whether you're making the right conclusions based on the assumptions and starting points. But it can't give you, for example, priorities, right? In this example, what's the priority? The environment or health? And then how do you weigh that cost and benefits? It's not just environment and health. There's a lot of advocates out there talking about animal rights. So now you have a third thing to balance out. So logic can't tell you exactly what's the priority here and what's not. I mean, maybe you can use logic to form your own priorities. If you made some conditional statements about your priorities, right? If you thought about your priorities enough, you can juggle them around. But it's all based upon where you're starting from. And then logic can help you out to get your conclusions. It's a very important point. I'm going to jump to Sarah's comments. So now that the two and I are discussing, but that was a great example. Let's see. Sarah says, one enlightening comment I heard once was concerning problems of decision making. When people say they can't make a decision, therefore they can't decide anything, logically that means they are deciding. Saying they are deciding for things to say the same way they are. So by logic, you cannot not decide. It's a good point. So I'll get to your second comment in a second. I think the first comment's really, really nice. But I think your argument is valid. So your argument, Sarah, that they can never not decide something because by not making a decision, they've decided already not to make a decision, right? I think your argument is completely logical and logically valid. But only because you defined it that way. Like your definition, I don't know. This is for me anyway, because again, this is based on the way you define what a decision is. Your way of deciding something, your definition of a decision is deciding to do or not to do something about a particular topic or activity. Right? If I decide not to go to a protest, then I'm still deciding to do or not to do something about that thing, about that protest. So I'm making a decision, even though I'm not doing anything. Whereas in some cases, I would even say the Stoics would delineate between deciding to do something and not deciding to do something. You can either make a decision or you don't have to make a decision. You don't have to do anything. So I guess it's based on your definition. It's but I really like that. Yeah, of course. You can also frame it that way. I like the idea that logic is about the structure of assumptions, not about if the outcome is right. This sounds like a computer code. The code will spit out a result of the coded structures, but the computer doesn't care or can't judge. Oh my God, yes. Actually, let me just come back quickly. There's another book. So I know we're on this book, but there's another book that makes me think of that. Yes. So if anybody's interested, there's a book that actually a very close friend in Berlin gave me. And I haven't done it yet, but I decided to give it to somebody else. It's called Invisible Women. And it's a recently published book, I think in the last year or two. And it's about generally it's about the it's about the little things that you don't necessarily think about all the time that women have to deal with on a day-to-day basis basically on a world created by men, pretty much. Like the average height of little things, like the average height of when you walk into a grocery store, the average height of the shelves, but their average height that the manufacturers make of the shelves is based on an average male height, which is not the average height of a female. So the little things they have to go through. The reason why I bring this book up is because there's a great section on coding and algorithms. Actually, there's a whole different book on algorithms. It's written by a woman. I forget the name of it, but it's on data. It's on data science, and she talks about how, and there's other sources for this topic, that of course, if you accidentally input the wrong, or you're careless about the inputs or algorithms you're coding into the computer to run its software and to make sure, reach the objectives you want it to make, that can get iffy. We're seeing this with Facebook now, right? Where if they're careless about how its algorithm works, it could start spreading hate speech and fake news. So, and people assume it's correct, right? People assume they're just going to take that information at face value. A lot of people will. Some people won't. Some people will recognize the hate speech and the fake news, but some people won't, because they're on Facebook and they trust the algorithm. But like you said, logic is just like computers and algorithms. The whole algorithm is just the process. The algorithm may be logically valid. It follows from one to the other because it follows the input and gets you to your output, but it depends on what you give as your input. And you're exactly right. The data is completely malleable. A lot of this book goes through, for example, most of this book is actually about the data gap that, unfortunately, we just don't have the data. So if you were to ask, for example, how to empower women when you created a subsidized healthcare system, the problem is that in some countries we actually don't have the data on female healthcare, only on male healthcare, because we only decided to use that data, or we disaggregate, or we only have aggregated data. So we only have the average data of any one person, but that doesn't mean we have the data on female versus males, which in the case of the shelves in the grocery store example plays a big role. Or like she goes through, for example, again, this book is great. I would read it. She gives a lot of other examples. But you're exactly right. Logic is a lot like an algorithm. They had this problem with crash test dummies. Yeah. She reads about that. She talks about that. It's one of her first chapters. She talks about the crash test dummies, where the crash test dummy is based on the general average body, but it's not, they don't take into account that females and males have different average heights. Yeah. Oh, it's based on the average male person. Okay. Yeah. Even worse. We would even prefer it to be based on the average height rather than just the male height. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but yeah, that's exactly what logic is. It's perfectly valid. There's nothing terrible or good about logic. It's just logic, right? It's just based upon how it's used. See, I also wanted to point out, so as we're continuing our book review, I wanted to point out another great section on, because if especially as I opened up this whole book review on the historical and cultural backdrop the authors place on logic. Why did this logician think about or study this during this time period? Well, because this was going on in politics and history around then. It would be great to give you a chance to read about that. So let me get actually, this is the chapter I'm in right now, chapter 7. And I was summarizing it before, but So 3 paragraphs, okay? So this is a little bit more than the other 2 paragraphs I read. It's going to be a long 3 paragraph quote I'll give you, but it does a great job of, and it's also a great example of what I mean by placing logic in its historical context. So they say, those involved in trade in European societies, and this was around the advent of the scientific revolution. So late 17th century. This is around the time late 17th century, still around the time of Galileo. They say those involved in trade in European cities or societies had become far more numerous, and the effect of this change was to transform nearly every aspect of modern intellectual life. The newly expanding commercial classes generated a vast new audience for literature based in vernacular languages rather than Latin. And the growth of this audience encouraged new political theories, new sciences, new literary forms, and a new spirit of reformist agitation, which eventually gave rise to the Enlightenment. The upshot was a general attack on the received learning of the past, and in logic, the consequence was a tendency to discount deduction as the logic of authority and to elevate induction, the logic of science, as the logic of fresh experience and novel experiment. In a changing world, probable inductions from new experience became the crucial method of argument, displacing the older method of necessary deductions from ancient philosophers. These newly rising middle classes were far more disposed than other groups to challenge tradition and assert their individualism, and the logic of induction and scientific method served this independence. In addition, the involvement of these same groups in an expanding world of commercial innovation forced them to be more tolerant of dissident opinions, because without this tolerance, their commerce was impossible to sustain. Persecutions and fanatical intolerance turned out to be bad for business. All these forces made early modern writers more interested in the logical role of physical experience in the forming of our beliefs, and the result, continuing into the present, was a detailed investigation of empirical science and experimental method. So, of course, we all know about this period. We all know the rising of commerce and trade around then, and how it spread ideas, so people became more tolerant. But the inclusion of the context of this radically changed people's idea of how to think logically is a major shift in history. And I love that. I love how he framed it like that, because I never thought of it like that. Like I was taught in the United States, so I'm not sure how some of these historical periods are framed in your history textbooks from when you went to school, when and where you went to school. So I was in high school or early schooling to secondary education from the mid 90s to late 2000s. And, you learn about the wars of religion and the scientific revolution, but you don't learn about any connection. And why would you? I mean, there's no direct causation between the wars of religion and the scientific revolution, not necessarily, because in history, you usually start learning about specific individuals like Descartes, Galileo. But this book and these 3 paragraphs place a great connection between all these things. They say, actually, it was the cultural understanding of how to logically empower yourself, basically. Deduction is fine. I mean, deduction is what we use in mathematics, right? And deduction is what we use all the time. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So deduction is still necessary. But for deduction to be the dominant form of logic used in everyday life, people started realizing, no, why would you ever do that? Why would I ever need to deduce something from an ancient philosopher or from the intellectual authority of my day just to form my conclusions about my experience? I can take direct experience observations that I'm making and then make conclusions based off of that, which is a lot like the scientific method. That's the logic of induction. And so I love the way they frame it. And I think I'm not a historian, so I don't know the specifics. Because this is a very big argument to make, right? But they have their resource, they have their citations at the end, and I think if it's not the only factor, and it probably isn't the only factor for dissent and political and scientific reformation at that time. But it was at least their change in logical thinking was at least a factor, it sounds like. And I do agree, at least some factor towards this change in society. So that was great, very, very interesting. My question to you, so just like before, I'm going to ask a question after this. So that was back then, this switch from, or not switch, but dominancy in everyday life from deduction to induction in their use of logic, to which ultimately empowered people to become more individually minded, to think critically for themselves, because based on their own experience. Today, now in the 21st century, in 2022, do you find another shift in logic? There's a lot of things going on in the world right now, and world-changing events right now. Do you feel like there's a logical shift happening, for better or for worse? Do you think people's understanding of how to be logical is helping to shape, for better or for worse, helping to shape geopolitical, cultural, social, or other events going on in the world right now? Hmm. I'm not sure what you mean by felt logic. Okay, let me read this in full. So Sarah's writing her first, she just made a comment. I think that with individualism, we have the negative effect of felt logic. I'm not sure what you mean by, you mean intuitive logic or like not intuition? Intuition is useful, so I don't want you to use their intuition. Like gut feeling? Do you mean like gut feeling logic? Oh, I don't even know what that is. Corna or coma skepticism? Coma. Corona skepticism. Okay, that makes sense. I was looking it up already. I was like, this is a new term for me. Corona or coma skepticism. But Corona skepticism. Aha. Okay, Matus, sorry, you can continue.
Um, So it seems to me that this is a valid point, definitely. I mean, we have an outburst of pandemic, and there is a lot of fake news, right? There is a lot of fake news about pandemic. There is a lot of fake news about war right now. So logic is a great tool to fight this. It seems to me that with logic we can see whether those informations are valid or not. So definitely, this is something even more important than perhaps even more important than in the past, because there is so much information if in nowadays world that it is absolutely necessary to have such tool to fight those misleading information.
Yeah, you bring up a good problem with induction, and that while induction and deduction, again, they're both useful systems of logic. It just depends on what field you're studying, right? Mathematics or physics. And in induction, used to empower people, and to an extent, it still does, right? I mean, we still need our everyday experiences as observations to, let's say, rise against tyranny. It's why people in Russia are protesting, because they can use their common sense when they observe what's happening in Ukraine and listen to their own propaganda, and they're protesting not just around the world but in Russia itself against their government. They can exercise their own reason. So it can be empowering, but you bring up a really good, and Sarah's also mentioned this with Corona skepticism, that with such an abundance of information and data out there, it's like, well, where do I get my experience from, right? Because if you're empowering yourself, there's a tendency to say, oh, look at all this information and experience that I can have. Let me take all of this and make a. So there's the problem of it used, and fake news is not new. It's old. Happens in every age. The perpetration of fake news and propaganda. It's definitely more prevalent now because of the internet. But Matus brings up another good point. Not just the fact that that you know people sometimes are not the best judges of which information is the best or the worst to use to base their conclusions and actions off of. Matus makes also the other point
I might have lost a connection with you, Steve. Not really. No, no.